Welcome back to LexTalks, Legal Topics Simplified, where we try to make, even the most confusing legal concepts a little bit clearer, especially if you're a law student out there. Today we're tackling something that sounds pretty dense, I'm not going to lie.
Okay.
It's delegated legislation and conditional legislation, sub-delegation, delegation of taxing power, and retrospective operation.
Oh, wow.
I know, right? Sounds a bit like a secret code almost.
Yeah.
But stick with us. It's not just jargon. It's actually the backbone of how governments really work.
Right.
To help us kind of untangle this, I've invited an expert who can, I think, explain this better than almost anybody.
Well, I'll try my best.
Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. You're right. It can seem really intimidating at first, but it's really about understanding the balance of power when it comes to law.
Okay.
Yeah.
So before we dive into the details, let's kind of zoom out for a second.
Sure.
What are administrative law? And why should a busy law student even care?
Right. So administrative law is kind of like the rule book for how government agencies operate.
Okay.
Think of all those bodies like environmental protection, Social Security, the ones that issue business licenses, that kind of thing.
Okay.
It governs what they can do, how they do it, and what happens when they maybe overstep their power a little bit.
So it's kind of like a legal watchdog, making sure that these agencies don't turn into little dictatorships?
Yeah, pretty much.
But how does that directly affect, someone who's studying to be a lawyer?
Okay, so think of it this way. Pretty much every single area of law you might end up specializing in, you're going to run into administrative law. If you're representing a client and they've been denied benefits, or maybe they're fighting some government regulation knowing administrative law, that's going to be key for your case.
Okay, so it's not just some theory.
No.
It has real-world consequences that are going to affect people.
Consequence.
You mentioned agencies overstepping their bounds.
Right.
Is that where this whole delegated legislation thing comes in?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's the heart of it. It boils down to the fact that legislatures, they can't micromanage every little detail of how a law is actually put into practice.
Right.
They got to delegate some of that power to administrative agencies, the folks who are often the experts in those specific areas.
It makes sense. Otherwise, Parliament would be debating the wording of a parking ticket, for months.
Exactly.
But that also sounds messy, right?
It can be, yeah.
How do we make sure that this delegation of power doesn't go too far?
Okay, that's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
It takes us back to the core of what administrative law is about, finding that balance between efficiency in government and protecting the rights of individuals. It's kind of like Lord Denning said, if administrative power isn't kept in check, it can lead us down a dangerous path, maybe even towards a totalitarian state.
Totalitarian stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, now you got my attention.
Okay, good.
How do we prevent that? Is that where this concept of separation of powers comes in?
Yeah, it's definitely a key piece of the puzzle. We often hear about how strict the separation of powers is in the U.S., with its branches of government. And here's something that's kind of surprising. Even in England, where that whole idea came from, historically, there wasn't that clear-cut separation.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
So Montesquieu, the guy who practically wrote the book on separation of powers, got it wrong.
His take on the British system wasn't totally accurate. Professor Ullman, he's a legal scholar, he put it really well. He said, England was not the classic home of separation of powers. Even back then, it was more about checks and balances between different parts of the government.
Wow, that's a history of law bombshell right there.
Right.
But how does this history connect to delegated legislation?
Well, delegated legislation itself actually kind of challenges that traditional idea of a strict separation.
Yeah.
It gives those administrative agencies, which are part of the executive branch, the power to create rules and regulations that essentially have the force of law.
So it's like blurring the lines between the legislature and the executive.
You could say that. And here's where things get really interesting. Different legal systems tackle this challenge in different ways. So the U.S., with its more rigid separation of powers, relies heavily on judicial review to keep delegated legislation in check.
Okay, so the courts have a big role in making sure the agencies don't go too far.
That's right. On the other hand, you have countries like the UK, India, which got their legal systems from the Brits. They rely more on legislative committees. These committees, they kind of keep an eye on the delegated legislation, and they can recommend changes or even revoke it if they think it's gone too far.
Interesting. So there's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Right.
Each system kind of figures out its
Exactly.
own way to deal with that tension, right,
Mm-hmm.
between efficiency and accountability.
Yeah.
What about in India specifically? Does the separation of powers apply there?
Okay, that's a great question, and it's tricky. The Indian Constitution, at first glance, seems to have a clear separation of powers, with the president, parliament, the judiciary all having their own roles.
But you said at first glance.
Yeah.
What's the catch?
Well, while those distinct roles exist, the Indian system is again more about checks and balances than that strict separation. For example, Parliament has the power to amend laws, even retrospectively, but they can't simply overrule a court judgment. The judiciary can review the laws Parliament passes and even strike them down if they go against fundamental rights.
So there's this constant back and forth between these different branches,
Exact.
keeping each other in check.
Yep. And this back and forth, this interplay, it becomes really important when we're talking about delegated legislation in India.
Okay.
A landmark case in the Red Ali Laws Act really highlights this.
Okay, case law. Now we're talking. What happened in that case?
Well, the Supreme Court had to decide if it was legal for the central government to extend laws from one part of India to another, with the power to kind of tweak those laws in the process. They had to figure out how much power the legislature could actually hand over to the executive without crossing a line.
So they were grappling with those limits of delegated legislation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What did they decide? Well, the judges, they had different opinions on it. But ultimately, they set two major limitations. First, they said the executive can't use delegated legislation to get rid of existing laws.
Okay.
That power stays with the legislature.
So they can't just, like, wipe out a law.
Right, exactly. And second, when they're modifying a law, the executive can't change the fundamental idea behind that law, the legislative policy.
Okay, that sounds like a pretty big restriction on what the executive branch can do.
It is, it is.
Yeah.
This case shows just how complicated delegated legislation can be, and it shows how carefully Indian courts interpret it to make sure the legislature's role is protected. It's not just a handover of power. It's about setting clear boundaries.
Okay, so we've established that delegated legislation is this powerful tool. It can really streamline government.
Right.
But it also has some built-in risks, right?
It does.
Can we talk about the different types
Yeah, absolutely.
of delegated legislation?
Okay.
Because it's not all created equal.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
You've got rules, regulations, orders, bylaws, directions. It's a whole buffet of legal instruments.
Wow.
And here's a key difference. Something that's labeled as a rule might just be an administrative instruction.
Okay.
And that difference can have real legal consequences.
Wait, so the name doesn't necessarily tell the whole story.
Nope.
How do you tell the difference then?
Well, there have been cases where things called rules were thrown out by the courts because they weren't properly published in the official gazette as required by law, so they didn't actually have the force of law.
So the form matters,
It does.
but the substance matters even more.
Even more. Courts are looking beyond just the label to see what's really going on.
This is getting pretty nuanced.
It is, yeah.
I'm guessing this is where understanding case law becomes super important for lawyers.
Absolutely. Case law provides that context.
Yeah.
Those nuances
Yeah.
you need to actually apply these principles in real situations. But before we go too deep into case law,
Okay.
let's take a little detour and talk about conditional legislation.
Conditional legislation. Okay, now I'm intrigued. How is that different from delegated legislation?
A great case that shows this is Sardar Inder Singh v. State of Rajasthan. In conditional legislation, the legislature actually makes the law itself.
Right.
But they give an outside authority the power to decide when that law actually kicks in.
Interesting. So it's like the legislature sets the trap, but the delegate gets to spring it.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
Okay.
Imagine a law that's designed to deal with a specific situation, like a natural disaster. The legislature creates the law, but the executive branch decides when to activate it based on what's happening on the ground.
Okay, I see how that could be useful. But let's go back to delegated legislation for a sec. You mentioned this term ultra vires earlier. Can you explain what that means to our listeners and how it relates to all this?
Okay, so ultra vires, it literally means beyond the powers.
Okay.
When we're talking about delegated legislation, it means that the agency or official making the rule has gone beyond the authority given to them by the Parent Act, the original law.
Right.
There are two main types, substantive and procedural.
Okay, let's break those down. What's substantive ultra vires?
Okay, substantive ultra vires means the actual content of the delegated legislation goes too far.
Okay.
It crosses the boundaries set by that parent act. Imagine like a regulation that allows companies to just fire permanent employees for any reason, even though the original law gave those employees some protection. That would probably be considered substantive ultravirus because it clashes with the whole point of that original law.
So it's like the agency's trying to make a rule that kind of contradicts the law they're supposed to be working under.
Exactly. And there are a few situations where this comes up a lot. One is when the delegated legislation just doesn't agree with the parent act, like the example we talked about. Another is when it tries to delegate essential functions of the legislature that should stay solely with them.
Essential legislative functions, like what? Give us an example.
The power to tax is a good one.
Okay.
Imagine a regulation that tries to impose a whole new tax, but the parent act didn't give the agency the power to create new taxes.
Right.
That would be a problem because taxation is a core function of the legislature. You shouldn't be delegating that lightly. It goes back to that delicate balance of power we were talking about.
So it's not just about agencies following the exact letter of the law.
Right.
It's about respecting that fundamental division of powers
exactly.
in the legal system. That makes sense. What about the other type of ultravirus?
Right. We also have procedural ultravirus.
Okay.
This is about how the delegated legislation was created rather than what it actually says.
So it's about following the right process.
Exactly. If the process of making the rule goes against the specific instructions in that parent act, it could be challenged as procedural ultravirus.
Can you give us some examples of what those procedural requirements could be?
Sure. Common ones are things like making sure to consult with specific groups before making a rule, publishing the rule in a certain way, or presenting it to Parliament for review.
Okay.
If those steps aren't followed, the regulation could be open to legal challenges.
Wow. So even if what the regulation says seems okay,
Right.
it can still be invalidated if the agency didn't follow all the steps in the process?
Exactly.
That's pretty wild.
It is. It shows how important it is to understand not just the content of the legislation, but also the framework around it, the procedures. It's a really important area for any aspiring lawyer to grasp.
Absolutely. We've covered so much ground already.
We have.
But I feel like we're just getting started. This is fascinating stuff. Unfortunately, we're going to have to pause here for now. But don't worry, listeners. We'll be back soon with part 2 of this deep dive. We'll go even deeper into how this works in the real world and the challenges of this complex area of law. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to LexTalks. Glad to be diving back into delegated legislation with you.
Yeah, ready to untangle some more of these legal knots. Last time we talked about how, delegated legislation, while necessary, really needs those clear boundaries so it doesn't overreach.
Yeah.
We explored those kind of tricky concepts, ultravirus, both substantive and procedural, and how those act as checks on administrative power.
Exactly. And we touched on those big questions like, delegating the power to tax and whether legislation can have a retrospective effect. But let's change gears a bit and think about how this all works in real life, especially for all the aspiring lawyers listening in.
Exactly. Our listeners, they're law students, so they're probably thinking, okay, this is interesting and all, but how does it affect me, as a future lawyer?
That's the question, right? The first thing to realize is just how MUCH delegated legislation is out there. It's huge. Parliaments, they just can't create super detailed rules for every single aspect of life. It'd be impossible. So delegated legislation fills those gaps, provides those practical details that make laws actually work.
So it's like the behind-the-scenes stuff that keeps the legal system running smoothly.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It covers everything. Environmental regs, financial markets, healthcare, transportation, you name it.
Right.
Because it's so widespread, it's absolutely crucial for lawyers to know how to navigate it all. This isn't just some abstract theory. It's the nuts and bolts of being a lawyer in so many areas.
Makes a lot of sense. But that brings up a challenge. How do you keep track of all this delegated legislation? I mean, it's not like there's one big book with every rule and regulation, right?
You're right. There isn't. And that's where it can get, tricky. Different countries have different ways of publishing and organizing it all. Sometimes finding what you need feels like trying to find a needle in a haystack.
Okay, I'm already feeling a bit overwhelmed.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to law students who are just starting to, wrap their heads around all this?
Sure. My first tip, get familiar with how it works in your jurisdiction. Where are the rules published? Are there online databases or search tools to help you? Just knowing where to look is a huge first step.
So it's like learning the layout of the land
Exactly.
before you go on your research quest, right?
Exactly. And my second tip, pay close attention to the hierarchy of delegated legislation. Remember, it all comes from a parent act passed by the legislature.
I know.
So always start by understanding what that act is all about, what's it trying to do. Then look at the powers it delegates and the limits on those powers.
So it's kind of like a pyramid. The parent act is at the top, and everything else flows from there.
Yeah, good analogy. If you get that structure, you can start to see where the problems or inconsistencies might be.
Makes sense. Understanding that hierarchy is key to figuring out whether specific rules even valid in the first place, right?
Absolutely. It's a fundamental principle that helps you make sense of it all.
Okay, that's helpful. Can we get even more specific, though? Could you walk us through, like, an actual scenario where a lawyer would need to use this knowledge? Something our listeners can picture.
Okay, let's say you're representing a client who's been denied a government license, maybe to run a business or build something they think it's unfair and want to appeal.
Okay, so where does delegated legislation come in? I'm guessing it's more complicated than just looking up the basic law about licenses, right?
Right. The first step, I asked to look at the main law about that licensing process. But that law likely gives power to a specific agency to set the detailed criteria for granting or denying those licenses.
Ah, so that's where delegated legislation comes in. The agency creates all the rules and regulations that make the process actually happen.
Exactly. Your job as a lawyer is to really look at those rules and regs. Are they consistent with the Parent Act? Did the agency follow the right process in making them? Are they being applied fairly and consistently to everyone? Those are the key questions.
It sounds complicated, especially if those regulations are super long and confusing.
It can be, yeah. But that's what makes understanding delegated legislation so important for lawyers. You have to be able to analyze the rules, find the potential problems, and then fight for your client effectively. It's knowing the rules of the game so you can play it right.
This is really eye-opening. It's kind of crazy how something that sounds so technical and obscure can have such a real impact on people. It's not just a theoretical thing. It's about people's livelihoods, their businesses, their lives, really.
You got it. And it goes way beyond licenses, too. Delegated legislation plays a big role in challenging any kind of government action or decision. Think about it. A lot of what the government does is based on these rules and regulations created through delegation.
So anyone who wants to challenge a government action needs to understand the delegated legislation behind it. Like, it's finding the legal foundation for that action.
Exactly. Let's say your client's a business that gets fined by some regulatory agency for maybe violating environmental regulations. You'd need to look at those regs closely. Are they valid? Were they enacted properly? Were they applied correctly to your client's situation? It all comes down to understanding delegated legislation.
So whether you're defending someone or challenging the government, understanding delegated legislation is crucial. It's like a secret weapon in your legal toolkit.
You could say that. It's about knowing how to use those legal tools. Now, let's talk about another big player in all of this, the courts.
Okay.
They have a role in reviewing all this delegated legislation.
Right.
Yeah,
This is where judicial review comes in. The courts step in to make sure things don't go off the rails.
that's right. Courts are essential in making sure delegated legislation stays within those boundaries set by the legislature. They can strike down regulations that are ultra vires, meaning they go beyond the delegated power, or if they're just unreasonable or unfair.
So they're kind of like referees,
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
making sure the executive branch doesn't abuse its power.
Exactly. They're protecting individual rights from being trampled by regulations that have gone too far.
And it's important to remember that courts also interpret delegated legislation.
Right. They do.
Sometimes the language can be ambiguous or unclear,
It can be, yeah.
and that leaves room for different interpretations.
Absolutely.
So lawyers have to figure out what those rules really mean in practice. It's not always so clear-cut.
Exactly. And that often means looking at what lawmakers intended when they created the Parent Act and looking at previous court decisions on similar issues. It's about building a strong argument based on precedent and reasoning.
Wow, it seems like this area of law is all about careful analysis and attention to detail. No room for sloppiness.
You got it. One small mistake could have a big impact on your client.
Definitely. We've talked a lot about the potential problems, but can you tell us about the good stuff? Why is delegated legislation so widely used, even with all these challenges?
That's a great question. Despite the potential downsides, delegated legislation has some clear advantages. First, it's just more efficient. Parliaments can't deal with every detail of every law, so delegating to specialized agencies lets them focus on the bigger policy picture.
So efficiency is a big factor. It's like dividing the work. Let the experts handle the details while the lawmakers focus on the big ideas. What else?
Flexibility is another key advantage. Delegated legislation lets the government adapt quickly to changing situations. Think about areas like technology or finance regulations need to keep up with how fast things change. Trying to handle all that through primary legislation would be way too slow and clunky.
That's where having those specialized agencies that can react quickly comes in handy, right? They're the ones who see things changing in real time.
Exactly. And those agencies often have the technical knowledge needed to create those detailed rules in complex areas. They understand the nuances and can create regulations that are effective and practical.
So it's not just about speed, it's about having the right people making the rules, people who understand the subject matter. But we also talked about how it can be abused and the need for safeguards. How do we find that balance?
That's the constant challenge, right? And that's where things get interesting. One way to improve things is to focus on transparency and public participation.
So making the process more open to everyone, not just legal experts. How do we do that?
Well, a lot of agencies already have to consult with stakeholders before making new regulations, industry groups, consumer advocates, even just members of the public. That helps make sure the rules are workable and consider the needs of those affected.
That seems like a good step. If people feel like they have a say, they'll trust the system more.
Yeah.
But how do you make sure those voices are really heard?
That's the tricky part. There's a lot of debate about this. Some say we need stronger legislative oversight, give Parliament more power to scrutinize and maybe even reject delegated legislation. Others want stronger judicial review, giving courts more power to strike down regulations that are too broad, vague, or just unfair.
So there are different ideas on how to find that balance between efficiency and accountability. Sounds like a complex legal A&D political puzzle.
It is. And it's a puzzle that legal minds like yours will be working on throughout your careers. It's always changing, and there's no one perfect answer. That's what makes it so interesting and important to study.
This has been amazing so far. I can't believe how much we've covered. We have to stop here and pick up the conversation in part 3. Don't go anywhere, listeners, because we're going to be talking about the future of delegated legislation and what it means for lawyers like you. Welcome back to LexTalks, listeners.
And we're back, ready to wrap up our look at the world of delegated legislation.
It really does feel like we've been on quite the adventure.
Yeah, for sure. From those unexpected little historical bits about the separation of powers to the real-life ways lawyers actually use this stuff every day, it's been a lot.
In that last part, we were talking about those real-world applications, right? Like how lawyers use their understanding of delegated legislation to analyze different situations or challenge government actions, really fight for their clients.
Right, and we touched on the courts and how important their role is as watchdogs, making sure that delegated legislation doesn't overreach.
Exactly. So now I kind of want to zoom out a bit, look at the bigger picture. What are some of the big trends, maybe some of the challenges facing delegated legislation, especially in the 21st century?
That's a good question, and it's becoming more and more relevant as things get more complex and technology just keeps advancing. One major trend is simply the huge growth of delegated legislation. There's more of it than ever before.
So it's not just about knowing the rules as they are, NW. It's about keeping up with this constantly changing landscape.
Exactly. It can feel overwhelming keeping track of it all. And that rapid growth brings up some worries about, accountability and transparency. How do we make sure all this lawmaking, which is happening outside of that traditional legislative process, stays fair, stays accessible, and really serves the public?
It's a good point. If it seems too complex, too secretive, people lose trust. They need to be able to understand the rules that affect their lives. How those rules are made in the first place.
Absolutely. And this problem is made even worse because delegated legislation often deals with very technical and specialized topics. Even for lawmakers, it can be hard to grasp all the details and really scrutinize these regulations properly.
So it's not just a lot of it, it's also just really complicated. That makes it even tougher for everyday people to get involved or even just understand what's going on.
You're absolutely right. And that's where lawyers have such a crucial role. We need to find ways to make delegated legislation easier to understand for ourselves, for sure, but for everyone.
So what are some things we can do? How do we make this complex system more transparent, more accountable?
There's no easy fix, but there are some promising ideas out there. One is just making how it's published and organized better.
You mean making it easier to actually find and understand the rules? Something more user-friendly instead of a wall of legal jargon?
Exactly. Online databases with better search functions, plain language summaries that explain the key points, maybe even some interactive tools that show people how different regs apply to their own situation.
I like those ideas. But just making information easier to find, that's only one part of it, right? How do we make sure people's voices are actually heard when these regulations are being made?
That's where stronger legislative oversight comes in. Parliaments need better ways to keep an eye on what those agencies are doing, even if they can't review every single detail.
So, finding ways for lawmakers to keep tabs on how their power is being used. Make sure agencies aren't going too far or creating rules that are just unfair or don't work in practice.
Right. Maybe this means special committees that focus on specific areas, maybe independent review bodies that assess how regulations are working, maybe even more public hearings where people can voice their concerns directly and offer alternatives.
That last one, that's a really interesting idea. Giving people a direct say in shaping the rules that affect their lives. It's a more democratic approach, isn't it?
It is. It's something we should definitely be aiming for. And technology can help with this too. What if we use data analysis or AI to help us spot potential problems with delegated legislation?
Interesting. We could use technology to analyze how the regulations are written, track their impact, look for patterns that might signal, overreach or inconsistencies, maybe even unintended consequences we didn't foresee.
Absolutely. We could have systems that flag potential issues for lawmakers so they can step in before those issues become big problems. It's a really exciting area with lots of potential.
Feels like we're on the cusp of a whole new way of thinking about this.
Yeah, I think so too. It's an exciting time to be involved in this area, and for future lawyers like you guys listening, it's a chance to shape the legal landscape.
Lawyers have such a crucial role to play, advocating for transparency, pushing for better oversight, making sure regulations are efficient, but also protect individual rights.
It's using our skills and knowledge to build a system that's fairer and more accountable for everyone.
This has been fantastic. I think our listeners will have a much better understanding of this area of law. Now it's so important, but so often overlooked.
I hope so. It's been great talking about all this with you.
Thanks for joining us on LexTalks. And listeners, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode.